It was 6 months after Cosmo Yarrow had blown his brains out that my grandmother asked me if I thought that he was in hell. Now, Grandma, she'd been a widow for years. My grandfather, who I never knew, was a preacher who worked the revival circuit before he died at the age of 44 in 1950, 3 years before I was even born. I suspect our church taught that anyone who committed suicide went straight to hell, but I don't remember my Sunday school teacher doing any lectures about the subject. Grandma seemed to have no particular agenda in asking. She took off her glasses, wiped her eyes with her hand-embroidered handkerchief as she waited for me to answer. I wouldn't know about that, Grandma. I'm not too much into that kind of stuff. Katie Doc, he says he's in hell. Well, what do you think? I shrugged. It doesn't seem like it. Cosmo was in a lot of pain, and he had no dependents. Well, I guess it was his call to make, I added helpfully. Grandma stared at me like I didn't fully comprehend her question. Now, I was far from being her favorite grandson. Although she never played favorites or anything, everyone has their own little system, I bet. I asked the ladies at church. I nodded my head, picturing them surrounded by stained glass, clucking their tongues, not even considering that Cosmo Yarrow could hardly sleep as cancer ate away at his stomach. Well, what did they say? They said you shouldn't have given him the gun. You shouldn't have told him that. It was your grandfather's. It was Orly's. I thought you'd want to keep it. I had no use for it. Well, it doesn't matter now. Grandma was going to miss Cosmo. Now, I don't think there was anything romantic going on or anything, but if you fixed meals for your sullen neighbor and delivered them at the back gate so as not to arouse suspicion, and he at least managed to grunt thanks, then maybe you had a good neighbor, or as good a one as any of us have a right to expect. Now, he was in hell now, according to Katie Dockey, but not for any dalliance with my grandma, as far as I could tell. At the estate sale, there was a lot of whispering about Cosmo blowing his brains out. I wanted to tell folks it was with my grandfather Orly's gun, but I didn't want to seem like I was bragging. Someone had already bought the shotgun by the time I got there. Although I never wanted to see it again, I did kind of want to know who bought it. I pretended to be helpful to folks picking over pieces of Cosmo, but I was just a little bit peeved that they had so little regard for who had owned the stuff. One lady, she sneered that it was a shame that the sheet music was ruined because Cosmo had written his name on all the covers. Despite her, I snatched it all up for $3, most from the 1930s. Little man, you've had a busy day. 50 chubby little toes, quintuplet's lullaby. I like the pictures on those. The trumpet pieces were so worn that the paper seemed almost soggy. Cosmo and his wife must have spent many happy hours imagining themselves to be in Bix Beiderbecke's orchestra. I would have bought the trumpet, but maybe it was a cornet. I don't know. But I didn't have $15 anyway. Most of the folks at the sale appeared to be a generation younger than Cosmo. They were interested in the tools and the body shop equipment, not sweet stuff or anything like that. Whoever bought the gun probably didn't even know that Cosmo used it for his self-medication. I took my stack of sheet music over to Grandma's house and watched the sale from her kitchen window. I looked up in the tree to see if I could spot the cross in the branches that she had taken as a sign from God that all was well in her world. You see, she struggled with the Almighty over the ailments that seemed to affect the men in her family, including my dad, who was acting so quirky that my mom wanted him to get rid of his gun. Grandma pointed the cross out to me several times up there in the tree, but I couldn't seem to see it without her assistance. I shifted my gaze back to the estate sale. I could see a man who looked to be even older than Cosmo loading an electric motor into his car. Cosmo used it when he built a table saw that took off 2 of the tips of his fingers. He disassembled it after that. A young woman struggled with 2 small children as she carried out a rocking chair. I recognized it as the one Cosmo was in when he went to his eternal rest. I guess the cleanup crew hired by the estate had done their job. Buyer beware. Ida Hickenell, one of Grandma's widowed Bible Club members, had sent a flower plant of some sort, presumably to help her as she grieved the loss of her neighbor. Now, I wasn't much of a gardener, but I offered to plant it in Grandma's kitchen window box so she could see it when she looked up into the tree for the cross. Grandma gave me $3 for my efforts, I knew it was pointless to refuse. God is good. I looked back to Cosmo's living room window and squinted. There were some wet leaves stuck to the glass like bits of brains. So let me set the record straight here, how Cosmo got the gun. Cosmo was not a hunter. He certainly wasn't afraid of intruders or the government coming to take away his rights. But 55 years ago, when he blew his brains out, no one seemed particularly surprised he had a shotgun. A pistol might have been out of character, though, but not a shotgun. That's not to say everyone knew. It's just that no one seemed to care one way or the other. My mother and my father knew where he got the gun, of course, and Grandma Velma, but at the estate sale, Cosmo had no one left in the world to even ask about that gun. Grandma and my parents are gone now as well. None of them blew their brains out, I'm glad to say. Of course, Cosmo's gun was the only one we'd ever had, but at the sale, if there was anyone left who cared where Cosmo got the weapon, they would have asked, because Cosmo was the sort of man whose friends were few and loyal. But there were none left to ask. Now, why should this start nagging me now? I feel confident that I am the only person on the planet thinking about Cosmo Yarrow, well, except for you, of course. Today on Holly Street, where he'd spent 60 years playing his trumpet and neatly signed his name on his sheet music, there were now tidy little buildings that the Weinbrenner Nursing Home had advertised as cottages for assisted living, for those who wanted to pretend to be independent. Now, Cosmo Yarrow was not the type to be a customer of the Weinbrenner Haven Nursing Home, I assure you. But his house and body shop had long ago been raised to make way for those who were. In the 1920s, probably wistfully thinking of their childhoods during the Victorian age, Cosmo's wife played the piano while he played his trumpet. It might have been a cornet. I still have the sheet music. I bought it at the estate sale. I should go in the attic and have a look. It doesn't matter. Cosmo was quite fond of my grandmother. She had long been a widow, and she was a widow when she moved next to Cosmo's house and body shop. But even living next door, she was not particularly close to Cosmo. After his wife died, though, my grandmother often cooked for him, and I want to think that charmed him a bit. I never knew my grandfather. He was a minister who died unexpectedly at the age of 44 in 1950, before I was even born in according to my dad, my granddad's funeral was standing room only. I wonder if he would have been jealous of Cosmo Yarrow, that he and my grandmother exchanged favors at the back gate, not that he'd blown his brains out, of course. I wonder if Cosmo would have been jealous of him. Not because he died so young, but that he'd had a large standing room only funeral. Why did my minister grandfather give my father a shotgun anyway? Did he think my dad might take up hunting? Maybe he knew Cosmo was coming down the pike and wanted to blow his brains. I'm just messing with you. Now I'm wondering what is happening in that place where Cosmo once sat as he pulled the trigger. Up there in the air where the chair once rocked. I stare at that nursing home and I try to place where that rocker had been in 1965. Are there cheerful people in scrubs helping others pull the trigger? Figuratively, of course. In that same spot where Cosmo did it all on his own. I liked to study what Cosmo did when he was tinkering on odd jobs for neighbors. He shut his business down soon after his wife died. Now, if it were me, I would have probably kept it going just to keep my mind from drifting off. But Cosmo said he'd had enough. He'd mostly stopped doing automotive work as his customers had died off. Also, he was the kind of guy who'd tell someone to take their car somewhere else if they questioned his skills. Even my dad. When Dad suggested there might be damage to the frame when he took his car there after an accident, Cosmo said, take it somewhere else. It's not worth losing the friendship of a neighbor over a dented car. Now, Dad tried to explain, but Cosmo wouldn't hear it. Just take it somewhere else. I think he didn't want to take a chance of messing it up, Grandma being right next door and all. I wonder if Cosmo would have been mad if Dad took his car somewhere else to start with. Mom made Dad give me that gun. I didn't really want it, so I gave it to Cosmo. He smiled when he took it, like it was fate or something. Now, Cosmo wasn't too great of an automotive man. To tell you he was some master tradesman would be a silly effort to mythologize him, to twist the story into something else for no good reason, good or bad. Cosmo played his trumpet as his wife played piano. Popular parlor room entertainment during the Great Depression. Cosmo was not a meticulous perfectionist. He just made things work or look pretty good. That, and he didn't charge much for his services. I'm not sure his name was even it doesn't matter. I could check the sheet music. Cosmo mowed his yard with a power mower. He sharpened the blades with a file and a whetstone. When I cut my grandmother's grass with a power mower, he waved at me with a smile that seemed a bit condescending in hindsight. I wouldn't have known that word at the time, but back then I might have said he was making fun of me. Probably his idea of making a joke, like, you want me to bring my mower over and do it right? Truthfully, it made me a bit mad. Not that I wanted him shot in the head, but I did chuckle a bit when he cut the tips of his fingers off with that cobbled-together table saw. I suspect part of the reason Cosmo ragged on me was that Grandma sprinkled her Bible babble on him a bit. Cosmo smoked a pipe and drank hard liquor. At Grandma's church, the communion was Welch's grape juice. Alcohol and tobacco would send you straight to hell. Dang, I guess Cosmo would have made it there without the shotgun. And although Cosmo might have been a bit smitten by my grandmother, I think she might have initiated the smite just a bit by tucking a Bible verse into a plate of pot roast and sweet potatoes at the back gate. I'm sure Cosmo Yarrow was not nearly the curmudgeon I make him seem to be, but to a 12-year-old, his jibes seemed cruel. I can't lie about it. Grandma told me once to lie if anyone came over while she was feeding Cosmo. I couldn't do it. When Katie Dockey brought her nosy self to the porch, I cheerfully told her Grandma and Cosmo were forking a bit of sweet potato pie together across the back fence. Miss Dockey left in a huff like I'd said something dirty. Some people need to dig hard for the truth even when it's staring them right in the face. Now, had he not shot himself, I doubt I'd remember Cosmo Yarrow today. Back then, I couldn't have thought there'd be the remotest possibility of my grandmother and him having any sort of romantic relationship. Although my grandmother was not then even 60 years old, in my 12-year-old mind, she might have been 105. Even a kiss couldn't have been imagined, except tenderly at his casket, had he not blown his head off. But still, I love to visit his shop. Some would say, oh, that's just Nordle, always looking for a bit of trash. If he can't figure out what it is, he'll make something new of it. When I was a kid, I carved a little space out for my stuff behind the bar in my parents' basement. The previous owners had made the basement into some sort of recreation room. It was kind of dumb because the creek flooded about once every other year and ruined everything the least bit perishable. But that was the only place I had for my stuff. I kept my stash of Cosmo cast-offs behind the bar, had my collection of shards of glass that I'd dug from the ruins of old glass factories. I'd sell them for a few cents each to Ernest Smythe. He was writing a book about Victorian pattern glass. I hid pulp magazines I dug from the dumpsters at the boys' dorm at the college down the street in this little cubby hole behind the furnace. Of course, since alcohol would send you straight to hell, the bar wasn't being used anyway, at least not to serve liquor. I'm surprised my parents didn't tear it out altogether for what it represented. Even today, I have no tolerance for those who carve man caves and movie rooms into their homes. No matter how fancy, it makes me think of a musty basement and trips to the landfill with waterlogged stacks of newspapers and cast-off sofas. But let me get back to Cosmo. He's a gruff reader of Bible verses, stained in gravy, made my grandmother somewhat of a widow for the second time. I've got to say he'd probably laugh at the little meditation spot Grandma had me make in the backyard of her new house. You see, she moved the next street over from Holly Street after Cosmo made his brain tissue unsuitable for an urn. According to Grandma, the move had nothing to do with Cosmo, but I suspect the old girl couldn't stand looking at that cross in her tree from her kitchen window, then down at that window that might have been spattered in Cosmo mush as she stood washing dishes in her apron-covered day dress. I bet she looked up in surprise when she heard that gunshot, wondered what sort of project Cosmo was building in his garage. Kaboom! Like a carburetor backfiring. She probably wore her sweet smile, thinking of Cosmo like some big kid with a science project. She didn't even know about the stomach cancer. So the day Grandma called me and asked me to check on Cosmo Yarrow was not a good one. In years to come, Long after grandmother had passed on, Dad was drooling while Mom tried to coax him to swallow a bit of food each day. I wondered what would have happened if I had not given him that gun. I suppose Cosmo would have managed some other method. But what about Dad and my grandfather? The very Reverend Orley Crew, young preacher who died while preparing a sermon. The man who gave my dad that gun on his 16th birthday in 1943, soon before he went off to war. So to recap, Reverend Orley Crew got the gun somehow. He gave it to my dad for his 16th birthday. My mother gave it to me when I was 12. Okay, I stop right there. I said I couldn't lie. Dad told me to give that gun to Cosmo Yarrow. I cried. I was 12. I lusted for that gun. My friends went hunting for squirrels, rabbits, and even pheasants with their fathers. My best friend gave me a rabbit's foot that he'd cut off himself. My dad never took me hunting, not once. But Dad knew about Cosmo's stomach cancer. He told me about it. And I thought, well, the man's going to die. Why should he have my gun? Was he going to spend his last days hunting? I doubt it. But I gave him my gun anyway. Dad promised to get me another gun. He never did. Thank you.